A father's final will should bring closure. Instead, it tore a wealthy family apart inside a cold Boston boardroom. When a smug older sister whispered a cruel insult, she thought she had won it all. Then, an estate attorney flipped a page and revealed a devastating, multi-million-dollar secret. The polished mahogany table in the conference room of Montgomery, Pierce and Associates felt as wide as a frozen lake, and just as unwelcoming. Clara Henderson sat near the edge, her hands folded tightly in her lap, tracing the frayed seam of her gray cardigan. At 32, she looked a decade older, her eyes shadowed with the exhaustion that only 5 years of relentless caregiving could imprint on a person's face. Across from her sat her older sister, Beatrice. Beatrice had arrived 20 minutes late, sweeping into the hushed legal office in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and an oversized camel coat that screamed effortless wealth. While Clara had spent the last half-decade managing their father's deteriorating health, navigating Medicare claims, sitting in sterile waiting rooms at Massachusetts General Hospital, and blending meals when his throat cancer made swallowing impossible, Beatrice had been living in a sprawling penthouse in Manhattan, working as the absentee vice president of their father's company, Henderson Manufacturing. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Their father, Thomas Henderson, had passed away exactly 3 weeks ago. He was a formidable man, a self-made titan in the industrial supply sector who had built an empire from a single warehouse in South Boston. He was not known for his warmth, but he was known for his razor-sharp intellect. Even in his final days, when his body was failing him, his eyes had remained piercing, tracking every movement, calculating every word spoken in his presence. "You look terrible, Clara," Beatrice said finally, not bothering to lower her voice. She casually flipped her perfectly manicured fingernails against the table. "I told you to use some of Dad's money to hire a night nurse, but you always had to play the martyr." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, refusing to take the bait. "I did hire a night nurse, Beatrice, but Dad didn't trust strangers. He wanted family. He wanted free labor," Beatrice corrected with a sharp, dismissive laugh. "And you gave it to him. Let's just hope he remembered your little sacrifices today. Though, knowing Dad, he respects winners. He respects the business." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the expensive wood. "I've already been speaking with the board of directors. Once the shares transfer to me, we're doing a massive restructuring. I'm taking the company public." Clara looked away, focusing on the frosted glass of the boardroom door. She didn't care about the company. She cared that her father was gone, that her childhood home was empty, and that she had put her own life, her career as an architect, her relationships on hold for half a decade. She didn't expect millions. She only hoped her father had left her enough to pay off the debts she had accumulated while living on a meager caregiver's stipend, perhaps leaving her the small cottage in Vermont where they used to spend summers. The heavy oak door swung open, and attorney Richard Montgomery stepped into the room. He was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a navy pinstripe suit. He carried a thick leather portfolio and wore an expression of practiced, professional neutrality. He had been Thomas Henderson's closest confidant and legal counsel for over 30 years. "Good morning, Beatrice." "Good morning, Clara," Montgomery said, his voice a deep, calming baritone. He took his seat at the head of the table, placing the thick leather portfolio precisely in the center. "I know this is a difficult time for both of you. Thomas was a remarkable man, and his absence leaves a significant void." Beatrice checked her Rolex, sighing softly. "Thank you, Richard. It's a tragedy, truly. But Dad was a pragmatist, and so am I. Let's get down to the business at hand. I have a flight back to Teterboro at 3. Montgomery paused, his eyes lingering on Beatrice for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Clara noticed the slightest tightening of his jaw, a micro-expression of distaste that he quickly masked. "Very well," Montgomery said, opening the portfolio. He adjusted his reading glasses. "We are here for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Thomas Arthur Henderson. As you both know, Thomas's estate is vast and complex, encompassing real estate, liquid assets, and, of course, the controlling interest in Henderson Manufacturing." Montgomery began reading the standard legal boilerplate. He detailed the revocation of all prior wills, the payment of outstanding funeral expenses, and the appointment of the executor. "I, Thomas Arthur Henderson, hereby appoint my eldest daughter, Beatrice Caroline Henderson, as the executor of this, my last will and testament, Montgomery read. Beatrice shot Clara a triumphant smirk. The role of executor meant control. It meant power. It was exactly what Beatrice had expected. Clara simply nodded, keeping her eyes fixed on her folded hands. Moving on to the distribution of real property, Montgomery continued, his voice steady. To my daughter, Beatrice, I leave the primary family residence located in Beacon Hill, Boston, as well as the summer estate in Nantucket. Clara's heart sank slightly. The Nantucket house was beautiful, but she had never liked it. It was too grand, too ostentatious. But the Beacon Hill house was where she had grown up. It was where she had spent the last 5 years feeding her father soup and reading to him by the fire. Beatrice hadn't visited the Beacon Hill house in over a year. To my daughter, Clara, Montgomery read, turning the page, I leave the property located in Burlington, Vermont, along with the sum of $50,000 for its immediate maintenance. It was the cottage. Clara let out a small, quiet breath of relief. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a home. It was enough to start over. Now, regarding the business, Montgomery said, and the air in the room seemed to shift. This was the crown jewel. Henderson Manufacturing was estimated to be worth over $80 million. Beatrice sat up straighter, adjusting the lapels of her coat. This was her moment of coronation. I bequeath my entire 75% controlling interest in Henderson Manufacturing, including all voting shares, stock options, and associated corporate assets, to my eldest daughter, Beatrice. Beatrice smiled, a wide, predatory grin. She leaned back in her chair, radiating satisfaction. She had won. She had everything, the houses, the multi-million-dollar company, the legacy. Clara had a drafty cabin and a modest maintenance fund. Beatrice leaned across the wide mahogany table, invading Clara's space. The scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. She looked at her younger sister, her eyes glittering with a mixture of pity and malice. This is what you deserve, Beatrice whispered, her voice low enough that the attorney might not hear, but sharp enough to cut deep. You were always just the help, Clara, a glorified maid. Dad knew it. You have no ambition, no drive. You wiped his chin, and I built the future. Enjoy the cabin. Clara felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Beatrice the satisfaction. She had loved their father. That had to be enough. Attorney Montgomery slowly lowered the document. He took off his reading glasses and folded them methodically, placing them on the polished wood. The silence in the room stretched, becoming thick and suffocating. He looked directly at Beatrice, his expression entirely unreadable. "Excuse me, Beatrice," Montgomery said, his voice slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. "I am not finished." Beatrice blinked, her arrogant smile faltering for a split second. "Not finished? You just read the distribution of the primary estate and the company. What else is there? The cars? Some antique furniture? You misunderstand the nature of your father's estate planning," Montgomery said calmly. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a completely different, noticeably thicker binder. It was bound in dark blue leather, stamped with the seal of a prominent financial institution. "What I just read to you was Thomas's will," Montgomery explained, resting his hands on the blue binder. "A will only governs the assets held solely in his personal name at the time of his death. However, 3 years ago, shortly after his diagnosis, your father instructed me to establish a revocable living trust. As per the law, a trust operates outside of the probate process and supersedes the will for any assets transferred into it." Clara frowned, confused. She had never heard her father mention a trust. She had sorted his mail, managed his checkbook, and paid the daily bills. She had never seen anything related to this. Beatrice crossed her arms, looking irritated but unfazed. "Fine, a trust. So, what's in it? Just read it, Richard. I have a board meeting to prepare for." Montgomery opened the blue binder. "To understand the trust, Beatrice, we must first discuss the current state of Henderson Manufacturing, the company you just inherited." "I know the state of the company," Beatrice snapped. "It's pulling in $60 million a year in gross revenue." "Gross revenue, yes," Montgomery corrected gently, "but net profit is a very different story. Are you familiar with a vendor company named Apex Logistics? All the color instantly drained from Beatrice's face. Her haughty posture collapsed, and she gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Clara watched her sister, bewildered. She had never seen Beatrice look terrified before. I don't know what you're talking about, Beatrice stammered, her voice suddenly shrill. Apex Logistics, Montgomery read from a document inside the binder, is a shell corporation registered in Delaware. Over the last 4 years, Henderson Manufacturing has paid Apex Logistics over $14 million in consulting and freight fees for services that were never rendered. Clara gasped softly. $14 million? Montgomery looked at Beatrice over his reading glasses. Thomas was ill, Beatrice, but his mind never failed him. He hired a private forensic accountant 18 months ago. He traced the ownership of Apex Logistics through a series of LLCs directly back to a private Cayman Islands account. An account registered in your name. This is slander, Beatrice shouted, slamming her hand on the table. You're lying! Dad would never! Your father kept meticulous records, Montgomery interrupted, his voice raising just enough to assert total dominance over the room. He knew you were embezzling from the company, Beatrice. He knew you were bleeding it dry to fund your lifestyle in New York. He also knew that to cover your tracks, you took out massive corporate loans against the company's equipment, signing his name as a guarantor using your executive privileges. The room was spinning for Clara. Her father had known. While she was feeding him, while he was quietly watching financial news on the television, he had been untangling a massive web of corporate fraud committed by his own daughter. Because of your actions, Montgomery continued, relentless and calm, Henderson Manufacturing is technically insolvent. It is saddled with $22 million in high-interest corporate debt. Furthermore, the IRS has opened an active investigation into the unfiled K-1 tax forms regarding those offshore transfers. Beatrice was hyperventilating now, shaking her head. No, no. The company. The company, Montgomery said, closing the file on the business, is exactly what you inherited, Beatrice. The shares, the debt, the IRS investigation, and the impending bankruptcy. You are the sole owner. You wanted the business. He gave it to you. The liabilities are now entirely yours. Clara sat frozen. This is what you deserve. Beatrice's cruel whisper from 5 minutes ago echoed in the silent room, but the context had violently inverted. Thomas Henderson hadn't given Beatrice an empire. He had handed her a ticking time bomb of her own creation. Now, Montgomery said, his tone softening slightly as he turned to the blue binder representing the trust, let us discuss the liquid assets. 2 years ago, anticipating the collapse of the manufacturing firm, your father quietly sold off the most valuable assets the company possessed. The intellectual property and the patents for the industrial valves he invented in the 1980s. He sold them to a major competitor, keeping the transaction heavily shielded under a strict non-disclosure agreement. He sold the patents? Beatrice whispered, her voice hollow. Without the patents, the manufacturing plants are just empty buildings. Correct, Montgomery affirmed. The sale of the patents, combined with his personal investment portfolio managed through Charles Schwab, generated a significant pool of liquid capital. Your father placed every cent of that capital into this blind trust. Montgomery turned to Clara. For the first time all morning, the attorney offered a genuine, warm smile. Clara, he said gently, your father was not an expressive man. He knew he took advantage of your kindness. He told me, sitting in this very office, that while one daughter was stealing his life's work, the other was selflessly giving up her own life to save him. Clara's vision blurred with sudden tears. Hearing that her father had recognized her sacrifice, that he had seen her, meant more than any amount of money. Montgomery looked down at the trust document. The Thomas Henderson Revocable Living Trust holds liquid assets currently valued at $38 million. Clara, as the sole named beneficiary of this trust, these funds are transferred immediately and irrevocably to you, entirely tax-free. Beatrice let out a strangled cry, practically lunging across the table. $38 million! You can't do this! I'll contest it! I'll drag this through probate for a decade! I am the executor. You are the executor of the will, Montgomery reminded her, his voice turning cold as ice. The will covers the house and the bankrupt, debt-ridden company. The trust is entirely separate from probate. It is ironclad. If you attempt to sue your sister, Clara will simply use her vast resources to bury you in legal fees, while you face federal indictments for corporate embezzlement. Beatrice fell back into her chair, her face pale, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the sheer terror in her eyes. The designer coat suddenly looked like a straitjacket. She had walked into the room believing she was a queen ascending to a throne. She was walking out as a criminal facing financial ruin. Clara sat quietly, the frayed edge of her gray cardigan still in her hands. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Her father had protected her. He had ensured that the daughter who stayed by his side when the lights grew dim would never have to worry about the dark again. 6 months had passed since the reading of the will, and the contrasting trajectories of the Henderson sisters could not have been more absolute. For Clara, the biting Vermont winter had thawed into a brilliant restorative spring. She had moved into the Burlington cottage, but it was no longer the drafty, neglected cabin Beatrice had mocked. Drawing on her dormant architectural degree, Clara had spent the last few months transforming the property. With the backing of the $38 million trust, she hired a premier local contracting firm, expanding the footprint with floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked Lake Champlain, blending mid-century modern lines with rustic warmth. More importantly, Clara was reclaiming her own identity. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, replaced by the quiet glow of someone who finally had the freedom to breathe. She established a private foundation, the Henderson Caregiver Initiative, endowing it with $5 million to provide financial stipends and mental health resources to unpaid family caregivers. She had also quietly retained her own financial advisor, a meticulous man named Arthur Pendleton from a Boston wealth management firm, to ensure the remaining trust was invested securely and ethically. 300 miles away in Manhattan, Beatrice's world was violently unraveling. The collapse of Henderson Manufacturing wasn't just a financial disaster, it was a public spectacle. The moment Attorney Montgomery had legally transferred the controlling shares and corporate debt into Beatrice's name, the dominoes began to fall. Her father's forensic accountant had preemptively forwarded his findings to the Internal Revenue Service. 2 weeks after the funeral, federal agents executed a search warrant at Beatrice's New York penthouse, seizing hard drives, financial ledgers, and offshore banking tokens. Beatrice quickly discovered that the arrogance she wore as armor was useless against the federal government. Her high-priced defense attorney, Jonathan Reed, sat her down in a sterile interrogation room and delivered the brutal reality. The Delaware Shell Company, Apex Logistics, is a smoking gun, Beatrice, Jonathan had explained, pacing the floor. They have a paper trail a mile long showing you authorizing $14 million in phantom invoices, which went directly to the Cayman accounts. You used corporate assets to buy the penthouse, your Aston Martin, and those trips to St. Bart's. It's textbook wire fraud and tax evasion. But I'm the executor, Beatrice had shrieked, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a life preserver. My father left me the company. It's mine to manage. You didn't manage it. You cannibalized it, Jonathan shot back, losing his patience. The $22 million in corporate debt you took out? The creditors are calling it in. The company's credit rating is junk. You have to file Chapter 11 bankruptcy for Henderson Manufacturing by Friday, or the banks will seize everything, including the Beacon Hill estate, which you put up as collateral. The irony was suffocating. Beatrice had spent her entire adult life posturing as a ruthless, brilliant executive. Yet, without her father's actual products, the patents he had secretly sold off the company was nothing but an empty shell, sinking under the weight of her own greed. To make matters worse, the fallout at the manufacturing plant in South Boston was devastating. 400 workers were suddenly facing immediate layoffs with zero severance. Beatrice didn't care about the blue-collar floor workers, but the local media certainly did. News vans camped outside the factory, and Beatrice's face was plastered across the front page of the Boston Globe under the headline, "Heiress bankrupts Boston staple while dodging feds." What the papers didn't know, and what drove Beatrice to the brink of insanity, was what happened next. 2 days before the factory doors were chained shut, an anonymous corporate entity transferred $3 million into a specially created severance fund for the Henderson Manufacturing employees. Every single worker received a generous severance package, extended health insurance for 6 months, and job placement assistance. Beatrice knew exactly who the anonymous benefactor was. Clara. While Beatrice was fighting to stay out of a federal penitentiary and liquidating her jewelry just to pay her lawyer's retainers, Clara was using the trust money to clean up Beatrice's mess, playing the silent savior. The sheer humiliation of it burned Beatrice alive. By August, the banks foreclosed on both the Beacon Hill family home and the Nantucket summer estate to satisfy the massive commercial loans Beatrice had defaulted on. Her Manhattan penthouse was seized by the IRS pending the criminal trial. Stripped of her titles, her properties, and her father's legacy, Beatrice was left with absolutely nothing but a looming court date. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon in October when Clara heard the crunch of tires on her gravel driveway in Vermont. She was at her drafting table, sketching out plans for a new community center in Burlington, a pro bono project she had taken on. She looked out the expansive glass window and paused. A rented mid-sized sedan was parked haphazardly near the garden. Out stepped Beatrice. The transformation was jarring. Gone were the tailored Chanel coats and the aura of untouchable wealth. Beatrice wore a simple, wrinkled trench coat, her hair pulled back into a messy knot. She looked exhausted, her posture slumped, the aggressive fire in her eyes extinguished by months of legal terror and public disgrace. Clara walked to the front door, opening it before Beatrice could knock. The sisters stood on the cedar porch, the silence stretching between them, thick with the ghosts of the boardroom. "It's beautiful," Beatrice said softly, looking past Clara into the stunning, light-filled interior of the renovated cottage. "You always had an eye for space." "What do you want, Beatrice?" Clara asked, her voice calm and steady. She felt no anger, only a profound, heavy pity. Beatrice swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm going to prison, Clara. Jonathan Reed finalized the plea deal yesterday. The federal prosecutor is pushing for 4 years in a minimum security facility in Danbury. If I take it, they drop the wire fraud charges and just stick me with tax evasion." Clara leaned against the doorframe, absorbing the reality of the words. 4 years. "I have nothing left," Beatrice continued, her voice cracking as tears finally spilled over her lashes. "The banks took Beacon Hill. The IRS took the penthouse. My accounts are frozen. I'm living in a cheap motel in Queens, waiting to surrender myself next month. I don't even have enough money to pay Jonathan the rest of his fees." She looked up, meeting Clara's eyes with a desperate, naked plea. "I know I was awful to you. I know I was cruel in that boardroom. I was so angry that Dad made me work for everything while you just stayed home. But we are blood, Clara. You have nearly $40 million. I just need $1 million, $500,000, just enough to clear my legal fees and have something to start over with when I get out. Please." Clara looked at her older sister. She remembered the endless nights she had spent turning their father in his bed to prevent sores. She remembered the sneer on Beatrice's face in the lawyer's office, the callous dismissal of her sacrifice, the absolute certainty Beatrice had that Clara deserved nothing. "You didn't work for everything, Beatrice," Clara said quietly. "You stole it. You stole from the company Dad built from scratch, and you were willing to let hundreds of workers lose their livelihoods just to maintain a lifestyle you didn't earn. You weren't angry that I stayed home. You were angry that Dad saw through you." Beatrice flinched, stepping back as if she had been struck. "So you're just going to turn your back on me? After everything?" "I'm not turning my back on you," Clara replied. "I am simply letting you face the consequences of your own actions. Dad gave you exactly what you built. He handed you the company in the exact state you created." Clara took a deep breath, stepping out onto the porch and pulling a heavy, brass key from the pocket of her cardigan. "There's something you should know," Clara said, holding up the key. "Last month, the bank put the Beacon Hill house up for public auction. I bought it back." Beatrice's eyes widened in shock. You bought Dad's house?" "I bought my home," Clara corrected firmly. "The home where I took care of him. The home you used as collateral for your offshore accounts. It belongs to me now, free and clear. It's part of the trust." The realization hit Beatrice like a physical blow. The absolute totality of her defeat was finally clear. Clara had the money, she had the legacy, she had the family home, and she had their father's respect. Beatrice had a rental car and a looming prison sentence. "Dad always said you respect winners," Clara said, her tone devoid of malice, completely matter of fact. "He respected the truth. And the truth is," Beatrice, no amount of money I give you will change who you are. You have to do that yourself. Clara stepped back inside, pausing with her hand on the doorknob. I will pay Jonathan Reed's outstanding legal fees directly to his firm, so you aren't held in contempt. But that is all. Do your time, Beatrice. When you get out, if you have truly changed, you have my number. Clara closed the door, the solid click of the lock echoing in the quiet Vermont air. She watched through the glass as Beatrice stood frozen on the gravel for a long time before finally turning, getting into the rental car, and driving away. As the taillights disappeared down the winding country road, Clara walked back to her drafting table. The house was quiet, filled with warm afternoon sunlight. The storm that had plagued the Henderson family for years had finally broken, leaving behind a clean, clear horizon. Clara picked up her pencil, looked at the blank architectural blueprint in front of her, and began to draw her own future. What an unbelievable journey. Clara finally got the peace she deserved, and Beatrice had to face the harsh reality of her own actions. If you loved this story of karma and justice, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a dramatic twist. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on our real-life drama stories. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.